Imagine you're in Russia. The year is 1908.
Right in the thick of it.
Exactly. You're standing in the bitter cold of St. Petersburg, and the entire country around you is it's violently vibrating with the aftershocks of the 1905 uprisings.
It's a total powder keg.
A massive powder keg. We're talking about a society where the absolute unquestioned authority of the Tsar has just been cracked wide open. I mean, Bloody Sunday has happened. General strikes have paralyzed the empire.
Yeah, the old rules are gone.
Totally gone. The rigid, centuries-old rules of how human beings relate to one another are literally crumbling in the streets, and new rules are being written in real time. And in the middle of this chaotic, terrifying, just wildly pregnant historical moment, this massive existential question is hanging over the whole society.
Which is, what is the future of women?
Right. What is the future of women? And that brings us to our source material for today's deep dive. We are looking at a stack of incredibly potent, fiercely debated texts from 1908 and 1909.
Written by Alexandra Kollontai.
Yes, specifically, we're tearing into her seminal work, The Social Basis of the Women's Question. Now, she was writing this right before a major historical event, which was the first All-Russia Women's Congress in St. Petersburg.
And this Congress was a huge deal at the time.
Huge. And our mission today is to completely unpack Kollontai's deeply radical, incredibly sharp argument that the most popular feel-good feminist slogan of the era, women from all classes unite, was actually a dangerous, blinding illusion.
It's a really bold claim to make.
It is. We're going to explore exactly how she dismantles the very concept of a universal women's experience. And she does it by looking at society exclusively through the brutal, unforgiving lens of class economics.
But before we cross that threshold, we really need to establish the analytical framework of these sources, just for you, the listener.
Right, the mandatory impartiality disclaimer.
Exactly. Because the texts we're examining are foundational works of Marxist and social democratic theory.
Which means they have a very specific lens.
Right. That means they don't view history as, a series of great individuals making moral choices. They analyze society strictly through the mechanics of class struggle, the requirements of capitalism, and the fundamental conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie.
The workers versus the owners.
Precisely. And I want to be entirely explicit for you listening. Neither of us here is taking a political side or endorsing this framework. Our goal today is strictly educational and completely impartial.
We're just the messengers.
Exactly. We are here to report on, to unpack, and analyze the ideas and arguments contained strictly within Kollontai's original 1900s texts. We're functioning as your guides to understanding a highly influential historical perspective, mapping out its internal logic without debating its modern political validity.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's jump straight into the catalyst for this text, because the historical context is just fascinating.
It really is.
We have the first All-Russia Women's Congress taking shape in late 1908, kind of bleeding over into 1909.
And to understand the Congress, you have to look at the organizers. They were primarily what the text defines as bourgeois feminists.
So, middle to upper class.
Right. These were educated women drawn from the nobility, the middle classes, the newly emerging professional sectors, and internally they were paralyzed by this fundamental crisis of purpose.
They didn't know what they wanted the Congress to be.
Exactly. They spent a massive amount of time agonizing over what this Congress was actually supposed to achieve. Was it going to be a polite, socially acceptable gathering focused on, moral philanthropy?
Like aristocratic women organizing charity drives.
Yeah, discussing the moral uplift of the peasantry, maybe forming committees to combat alcoholism, very safe, respectable topics. Or, on the other hand, was it going to be a sharp, aggressive, political push for total legal and political emancipation?
And reading through the primary documents, you can really see them trying to thread that needle. But the detail that absolutely jumps off the page is what happened with the original draft program for the Congress.
Oh, the oversight. This is a crucial detail.
It's wild. In 1907, they published their preliminary agenda in a magazine called The Women's Alliance. And in that initial draft, they completely, utterly omitted the economic position of women.
Completely left it out.
There wasn't a single item on the agenda regarding the protection of female labor. I mean, that's like hosting a conference on oceanography and forgetting to put water on the agenda. They were organizing a national congress to determine the future of Russian women, and they just forgot to include the women who were actually working.
And Kollontai, she zeroes in on that immediately. She doesn't treat it as a typo or some minor administrative oversight.
No, she goes on the attack.
She interprets it as a glaring neon sign pointing directly to the fundamental blind spot of the bourgeois suffragettes. It demonstrated this profound structural detachment from the material realities of the working class.
Because they just weren't living in that world.
Right. The women organizing the Congress were consumed with the barriers they faced in their own lives: access to higher education, the ability to enter the civil service or legal professions, the right to vote and hold property independently.
All very valid things to fight for, but
But they were not at that initial stage, considering the millions of women whose primary concern wasn't getting into a university, but just surviving a 14-hour shift in a textile mill without losing a limb to an unshielded loom.
I look at that and I think, it's one thing to have different priorities, but to leave out the economic engine of women's labor entirely, it feels almost willfully ignorant.
Well, the text notes, they did eventually face massive backlash and corrected this.
Right, they dedicated the second section of the Congress entirely to female labor.
But for Kollontai, that initial draft was the mask slipping. It revealed who the Congress was really built for.
It revealed their default setting.
Exactly. And even after the correction, the overarching rhetoric of the Congress settled on this grand, sweeping rallying cry: the union of all women in the struggle for purely female rights.
Which is very sketchy.
You can easily picture the scene, right? Prominent feminists of the era, figures like Pokrovskaya and Kalmanovich, standing at the podium, delivering these soaring, impassioned speeches, looking out at a crowd and declaring, "Women from all classes of the population, unite."
And it's a highly seductive message. It appeals to a sense of universal sisterhood against a common patriarchal enemy. But why does Kollontai immediately hit the brakes on this peaceful and tempting slogan?
Because to understand Kollontai's rejection of this sisterhood, we have to look away from biology and look at the actual root of women's oppression, which, according to this framework, is economics.
Right, she completely dismisses the biological argument.
She's actually incredibly sarcastic about it. She writes that she is perfectly happy to leave it to the bourgeois scholars to waste their time measuring craniums, weighing the brains of men and women, and debating their inherent intellectual capacities.
Because whether a woman has a biologically different brain or not is entirely irrelevant to why she is legally subjugated.
Precisely. If we want to understand her framework, you have to understand the concept of historical materialism.
Break that down for us.
Think of human society like a massive, deeply rooted tree. The soil, the root system, the water that is the economic base. That's how we produce goods, how labor is divided, who owns the factories, who owns the land.
Okay, the foundation.
Right. And everything else, our culture, our laws, our religion, our concepts of gender, our marriage structures, those are just the leaves and the branches. They grow out of that economic root system.
So if you want to change the color of the leaves, you can't just paint them, you have to change the soil.
Exactly. Kollontai argues that the bourgeois feminists are basically trying to paint the leaves. They're looking at the oppression of women and blaming biology or blaming the subjective attitudes of men.
But the Marxist concept says it's the economics that caused the enslavement.
Yes. Specific historical economic shifts in the past, like the rise of private property and the division of labor, relegated women to unpaid domestic reproduction. Natural or biological characteristics were purely secondary.
They were just used to justify an economic arrangement after the fact.
Exactly. Therefore, women can only be truly free in a world with newly organized social and productive lines. If economics built the cage, only a radical reorganization of the economic system can dismantle it.
And what I love is that she backs this up with an avalanche of data. She doesn't just theorize. She brings the receipts to prove that the economic foundation is already shifting under everyone's feet.
The statistics are actually staggering for the time.
They really are. She pulls from the early 1900s national censuses. She points out that by this period, women were already producing roughly 1/3 of the total world production of goods.
A third of the world's goods.
Yeah. And when you look at the percentage of the female population living entirely on its own earnings, the numbers just completely disrupt the entire Victorian narrative of the fragile, dependent woman.
What were the numbers like in Europe?
In Austria, it was 47%. Nearly half the women in the country were economically independent. In Italy, 40%. Switzerland, 29%. France and Great Britain, around 27%.
We really have to pause and visualize what that actually means for a society. We are not talking about a small fringe demographic of, unmarried governesses.
No, we're talking about massive segments of the population participating directly in the capitalist market.
And then she brings it home to Russia.
Right. The percentage was lower there, About 10% of women living on their own earnings. But because the Russian Empire was so astronomically large, 10% translated to over 6 million independent women.
6 million women waking up, leaving their homes, and selling their labor to survive.
Exactly, and she lists out where they are. It's not just domestic service. Female labor absolutely dominated the textile industry. You had thousands of women working in bakeries, cosmetics manufacturing, glass factories, china production, brickyards.
The visual reality of St. Petersburg in the winter of 1908 is essential here. At dawn, the streets would be choked with women in heavy wool shawls, trudging toward the industrial districts.
It's a total structural transformation of the workforce.
It is. Kollontai notes that in St. Petersburg alone, by 1900, for every 100 men living by their own labor, there were 40 women.
But wait, I want to push back on this, or at least play devil's advocate using the realities of the time, because the text openly acknowledges that male workers were terrified of this.
They absolutely were.
They watched this constant, massive influx of female labor into the factories, and they viewed these women as dangerous existential rivals. The women were being hired to replace the men, to flood the labor market, and fundamentally destroy whatever meager wages the men had managed to secure.
Which is the classic anxiety of the proletariat.
Right. If we look at basic, brutal, classical economic supply and demand, isn't that male fear entirely justified? If an employer suddenly has access to 6 million new workers who are legally and socially conditioned to accept lower pay, wages across the board are going to plummet.
You are articulating the exact argument used by bourgeois economists to justify pitting workers against each other. Kollontai anticipates this, and her counter-argument is one of the most intellectually elegant parts of the text.
How does she dismantle it?
She dismantles this fear by severing the biological identity of the woman from the economic function of the unorganized worker. She argues that a female worker is only a threat to wages when she is isolated, desperate, and unorganized.
Because capital will always seek out the path of least resistance.
Exactly. It'll find the most vulnerable person in the room and use their desperation as a weapon against the person who is demanding a fair wage. But Kollontai asks a piercing question. Is this unique to women?
Oh, I see where this is going.
She points to the hungry village yokel, the desperate peasant who moves to the city after his crops fail, or the ruined artisan who's been pushed out of his trade by mechanization. They are men, yet their arrival at the factory gates also lowers wages.
Because they're also desperate.
Right. The detrimental effect on the male worker's livelihood is not caused by the fact that the new worker is female. It is caused by the fact that the new worker is part of the unorganized, less conscious section of the working class.
The capitalist employer weaponizes her lack of organization to break strikes and depress wages. That shifts the paradigm completely. The threat isn't gender. The threat is the structure of unorganized labor itself.
And this leads to her synthesis. The moment that unorganized woman is brought into the fold, the moment she joins the union, enters the ranks of the organized labor movement, and fights alongside the men for working-class liberation, she instantly ceases to be a rival.
She becomes a comrade.
Yes. The organized proletariat, regardless of whether they are male or female, loses their capacity to be used as a weapon against their own class.
I see how that functions practically. Kollontai is essentially telling the male union organizers, stop looking at the woman next to you at the loom as the enemy. Your enemy is the man in the management office who is using her starvation against you. If you organize her, you disarm him.
It's a call for radical class solidarity that completely bypasses gender divisions.
Which brings us to a really fascinating historical rupture in the text. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if millions of proletarian women are already bleeding in the factories, already figuring out how to unionize, already striking alongside men, where exactly are the bourgeois feminists during all of this?
They're certainly not in the factories.
No. The bourgeois feminists love to call themselves the vanguard of the women's movement. But Kollontai looks at the timeline and accuses them of being incredibly, embarrassingly late to the party.
To understand Kollontai's accusation of what we might call stolen valor, we really have to look deeply at a specific turning point in Russian history, which is the 1861 Emancipation Reform.
The abolition of serfdom. Let's explore the mechanics of that, because it wasn't just a moral decree, it was an economic earthquake.
It was a total collapse of the existing agrarian economic model. Prior to 1861, the Russian nobility and the upper middle classes essentially lived off the unpaid forced labor of serfs.
Right.
When serfdom was abolished, the state instituted a highly complex, deeply flawed system of redemption payments. But the practical reality was that a massive portion of the landowning class suddenly found themselves plunging into bankruptcy.
The free labor dried up and estates crumbled. And the immediate domino effect of that is what happens inside the homes of those formerly wealthy families. You suddenly have a whole generation of middle-class wives and daughters, women who were raised to be ornaments, whose entire life trajectory was supposed to be a comfortable marriage funded by a dowry, who were abruptly staring down the barrel of absolute poverty.
They faced a menacing dilemma. The dowries were gone. The patriarchal safety net had evaporated. They either had to accept destitution or they had to go out into the public sphere and secure the right to earn their daily bread.
So the entrance of the bourgeois woman into the workforce wasn't sparked by some sudden philosophical awakening about female empowerment.
No, not at all.
It wasn't driven by high-minded feminist ideals. It was driven by sheer economic panic. The money ran out.
Economic panic is the exact phrase. Kollontai points out that these middle-class women suddenly started knocking on the doors of universities, demanding access to art salons, editorial offices, civil service positions.
They demanded freedom of profession.
Yes. And when they tried to enter these comfortable middle-class professions, they ran face first into entrenched resistance from the professional men who already held those jobs and had absolutely no intention of sharing the wealth or the prestige.
Of course.
That specific, stubborn, turf war middle-class women fighting middle-class men for access to white-collar employment is what Kollontai identifies as the true birthplace of bourgeois feminism.
And this is where her critique becomes just venomous, because these bourgeois women fought their way into the universities, the editorial boards, and they proudly crowned themselves the pioneers, the absolute vanguard of women's liberation.
But they were ignoring something massive.
Exactly, the staggering hypocrisy of it all. While the bourgeois women were fighting for the right to be a lawyer or a doctor, they completely ignored the fact that they were walking on a path already paved by their younger sisters.
The proletarian women.
Hundreds of thousands of working-class women had already been forced out of the home and into the factories decades earlier. The working-class woman had already normalized female labor on the world market through the literal destruction of her own body in the industrial machine.
Kollontai is stripping away the mythology of the feminist movement of her time. She is asking how you can possibly claim to be the brave pioneer of women's independence when working-class women have been sustaining the global economy with blistered hands for generations.
It's a devastating critique.
And this profound difference in how and why the two classes of women entered the workforce dictates their entirely different definitions of who the enemy actually is.
Let's break down that ideological divide, because it really explains why they can't ever truly unite. For the bourgeois feminists, the text makes it clear. The enemy is men.
Right.
They look at the society around them, they look at the civil service, the parliament, the universities, and they see that men have unjustly seized all the rights, all the privileges, and all the comfortable jobs. Women are left with nothing but duties and chains.
So their strategy is simple.
Exactly. Defeat the men and take a share of the privileges the men currently hold.
But for the proletarian woman, men are not the enemy. The working-class man does not hold any privileges. He doesn't have a comfortable job or political power to share. He is a comrade in suffering chained to the exact same machine.
So who is the enemy for the working woman?
For the proletarian woman, the enemy is capitalism itself. Kollontai uses a deeply visceral metaphor in the text to describe the capitalist system. She calls it an insatiable monster with its gilded maw that falls upon man, woman, and child with equal voracity, sucking them dry to grow fat on human lives.
Wow. That makes me think of an analogy. Imagine the current society, the current economic system is a towering building, and it is completely engulfed in flames.
Okay, I like this.
So the bourgeois feminists are standing outside, fighting with the men for the right to hold the fire hose. They don't want to put the fire out or change the nature of the building. They just want equal access to the tools of authority. They want to be the ones managing the crisis.
Right, they want a promotion within the burning building.
Exactly. But the proletarian women are looking at the bourgeois women and saying, we don't care who is holding the hose. The building is designed to burn us alive. We need to completely demolish this structure and design a totally new fireproof building, and we need to do it together with the men who are trapped inside with us.
The analogy holds up perfectly because it highlights the limits of bourgeois ambition. The feminists are demanding equality within the existing class society. They don't want to destroy the system of class privilege. They simply want to extract their fair share of it.
They want a piece of the pie.
Exactly. But for a working-class woman, achieving equal rights within a capitalist framework is a meaningless victory. It just guarantees her an equal share in inequality. It means she wins the legal right to be exploited by a factory owner exactly as thoroughly as her husband is exploited.
That is not liberation. That is just gender-neutral subjugation. And this massive theoretical chasm between the classes doesn't just play out in the factories or in the political sphere. It violently clashes in the most intimate, private space imaginable,
Ugh.
the home.
The battleground of the family.
Right, we have to look at marriage and child-rearing. Because even if a woman achieves some measure of economic independence by working, the legal and social architecture of the family in 1908 was explicitly designed to crush her.
We have to examine the legal reality of the civil codes in most industrialized countries at that time. The law placed a married woman in a state of direct, unmitigated dependence on her husband.
She had no legal autonomy.
None. He generally had the legal right to dispose of her property, to control her wages, and he possessed the legal right of moral and physical dominance over her.
And where the strict letter of the law ended, the crushing weight of public opinion and social hypocrisy took over. The text discusses the double morality of the era. Society deliberately paid women starvation wages, catching them in this inescapable economic vice.
And what options did that leave them?
Once they were economically trapped, society offered them only two viable options for survival: submit to the legal bondage of a traditional patriarchal marriage, or submit to the embraces of prostitution.
It's a brutal reality. And into this grim reality, the bourgeois feminists introduce a concept that sounds incredibly radical and liberating: the concept of free love.
Right.
The progressive women of the bourgeoisie began advocating for the rejection of the traditional church marriage. They demanded the right to dare to love, to form romantic and sexual unions without state orders, without legal chains, based entirely on mutual inclination and personal freedom.
I remember reading that section and being genuinely surprised. On paper, free love sounds identical to modern progressive views on relationships. It sounds like a total rejection of patriarchal control.
It does.
I immediately thought, why on earth is Kollontai, a radical socialist, rejecting this? Why doesn't she embrace it? It sounds so progressive. Why is she intensely critical of a movement that says women should be free to love whoever they want without a marriage contract?
She rejects it because she applies that historical materialist lens to the concept. She looks past the romantic poetry of the idea and examines its raw economic mechanics.
Okay, what does she find?
She essentially argues that free love is a luxury good. If you are the heroine of a French novel, or if you're a wealthy bourgeois woman with your own inherited capital, a trust fund, independent means you can absolutely throw down the gauntlet, reject marriage, and practice free love.
Because you have a safety net.
Yes, you have the financial armor to survive the social consequences. But Kollontai asks, what happens when you introduce the concept of free love to a woman who has no capital, insufficient wages, and absolutely no social safety net?
The reality is catastrophic. Because if you implement free love consistently across a capitalist society without first fundamentally changing the economic structure of that society, all you are doing is destroying the formal marriage contract.
And what was that contract, practically speaking?
In 1908, that contract was the only legal mechanism, however flawed and oppressive, that forced the man to bear some financial responsibility for the consequences of the relationship. It was a guarantee that all the immense physical, emotional, and financial costs of maternity wouldn't fall entirely on the woman alone.
Precisely. Without the legal bind of marriage, free love under capitalism simply saddles the working-class woman with a devastating new burden. She now has the impossible task of caring for her children completely alone, paying for their survival on a starvation wage, while continuing to be ruthlessly exploited by her employer.
It's a trap.
It is. Kollontai draws a brilliant, razor-sharp parallel to labor history to explain this. She compares the feminist demand to abolish the marriage contract to the historical moment when capitalist governments abolished the old guild regulations for workers.
Oh, wow. That is a fascinating parallel. Let's dig into that.
When the guilds were dismantled, the capitalists called it a great victory for freedom. They called it freedom of contract for labor and capital. They told the worker, you are no longer bound by the restrictive rules of the guild. You are free to negotiate your own wage directly with the factory owner.
But in reality, what did that freedom mean?
It meant stripping the worker of their only collective protection, leaving them entirely at the mercy of the capitalist, resulting in naked, unchecked exploitation. Kollontai is arguing that preaching free love to a working woman under capitalism is exactly the same trick.
You are stripping away her only legal protection and calling it freedom, while leaving the economic system that crushes her completely intact.
Exactly.
And the text points out a truly dark, disturbing reality about how free love was already being practiced. The bourgeois feminists are treating it as this high-minded, philosophical ideal discussed in literary salons. But Kollontai forces the reader to look at the factory floor.
And what's happening there is horrific.
It is. She points out that factory owners, managers, and the wealthy masters of the house are already practicing their own twisted, coercive version of free love every single day. They use their immense economic power, the constant threat of dismissal and starvation, to force female factory workers, clerks, and domestic servants to satisfy their sexual whims.
The power dynamic is entirely one-sided.
Right. They routinely assault their servants and then just throw them out onto the freezing streets the moment they become pregnant.
So when a wealthy feminist stands up and preaches the virtues of free love and the abolition of marriage, the working-class woman doesn't hear a message of liberation. She hears an endorsement of the very system that currently leaves her entirely unprotected and vulnerable to the predatory whims of her employer.
This raises the obvious, massive question. If the traditional patriarchal marriage is an oppressive cage, but free love, under capitalism, is a deceptive trap that leads to ruin, how do you actually solve the problem of the family? What is Kollontai's solution?
Her solution requires a total paradigm shift. She argues that you cannot solve the family problem by merely tinkering with the laws of marriage or changing the subjective feelings of individuals. You have to change the entire material foundation of child rearing.
The economics of it again?
Always. True freedom for women, she insists, can only be achieved if society and the state step in and entirely take over the economic obligations currently forced upon the individual family.
Meaning, society needs to fundamentally relieve women of the exhausting, unpaid, petty household cares. Society, as a collective, must take full responsibility for the younger generation. The state must protect maternity, provide comprehensive financial and structural support for the mother and the child,
so that the woman's survival and her child's survival are no longer financially dependent on the unpredictable goodwill of either a husband or a capitalist boss.
And in making this argument, she actively dismantles another highly popular feminist slogan at the time, the right to maternity.
Yes, championed by influential figures like the Swedish writer Ellen Key.
Right. Key argued that motherhood was a woman's sacred aim, her ultimate biological and spiritual purpose. She envisioned an ideal society based around isolated, perfect family units held together purely by love, where the woman's primary role was the spiritual elevation of her children.
But Kollontai looks at Ellen Key's idealized, isolated family unit and sees another capitalist trap. First, she argues that defining a woman's primary value through maternity reduces her from a complex human being to a mere biological female.
Which is incredibly limiting.
But more importantly, she analyzes how the isolated family unit functions economically. This is a crucial piece of Marxist analysis. Kollontai argues that the frantic, isolated individual family unit is itself a direct product of the monstrous competitive capitalist rat race.
How so?
Why do people cling so desperately to the insular family? Because capitalism is a brutal, alienating system where everyone is pitted against everyone else. The family becomes the only tiny refuge, the only place where a person might find support. And capitalism loves the isolated family unit because a worker who is terrified that his isolated wife and children will starve is a worker who will never go on strike. He will accept any wage, endure any abuse, because he alone bears the total burden of his family's survival.
Oh, wow. That is such a profound insight. The isolation of the family guarantees the docility of the worker.
Yes. So Kollontai argues that if you abolish capitalism and create a collective, socialist society, a society that genuinely cares for all its members, provides for all children, and guarantees survival, that frantic, egoistic, terrified clinging to the isolated family unit naturally dissolves.
People will still love each other. They will still have children.
But the economic terror that currently glues the oppressive family structure together will be gone.
It's just a completely different universe of thought. The bourgeois feminists are fighting a legal fetish. They're obsessed with the marriage contract itself. The proletarian women are waging a structural war against the underlying economic mechanics that make that contract a matter of life and death in the first place.
Yeah. Exactly. So we've established that across economics, labor, and the intimate structure of the family, the interests of the bourgeois woman and the proletarian woman are fundamentally opposed. But this brings us to the ultimate political mirage of the era.
The fight for the ballot.
Right. What happens when the bourgeois women pivot, look at the working women, and offer a political compromise? What happens when they say, okay, we fundamentally disagree on the economics of the factory, we completely disagree on the structure of marriage and maternity, but surely we can unite on one single transcendent issue, the right to vote. The ballot box is an above-class issue. Let's unite to win suffrage.
And the feminist pitch is incredibly persuasive. They argue to the working women, even if we disagree on economics, once we, the educated women of the bourgeoisie, have secured deputy seats in parliament, we will use our new power to cure the social sores together. We will legislate changes to the civil codes. We will pass laws to improve your working conditions. Just help us get our foot in the door.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Kollontai issues a severe, almost apocalyptic warning against accepting this alliance. She demands that working women look deeply at why bourgeois women actually want the vote.
It's not just about abstract justice for them.
Not at all. Remember the broader historical timeline we discussed? Industrial capitalism is rapidly expanding in Russia. The bourgeoisie as a class is gaining immense economic power, but they need political power to secure and expand their economic prosperity.
Capital needs laws to protect itself.
Exactly. Capital requires certain legal norms, property guarantees, and infrastructure to flourish, and it can only secure those if its representatives are writing the laws in government. For bourgeois women, attaining political rights is not just a matter of abstract justice, it is a concrete necessity dictated by their own class interests. They need the vote to protect their inherited property, their businesses, and their capital.
And here is the truly chilling prediction she makes in the text. She states that for the working class woman, winning the right to vote under a capitalist system just means, once again, an equal share in inequality. She gets to vote for which member of the ruling class will exploit her next.
Exactly.
But for the bourgeois woman, winning political rights elevates her to a position of unprecedented institutional power. She becomes a fully enfranchised member of the ruling class. And Kollontai predicts that the bourgeoisie will inevitably use those new privileges to further oppress their younger sisters.
It's an inevitable betrayal.
Now, I have to stop and really chew on this, because it is the most cynical part of her argument. I struggle with this Machiavellian framing. You're telling me that these bourgeois women, women who have spent years organizing, facing police crackdowns, printing illegal pamphlets, sincerely advocating for universal suffrage, are just going to immediately turn their backs on working-class women the absolute second they get a parliamentary seat. Are they really that duplicitous? It feels like Kollontai is ignoring the genuine moral convictions of thousands of women.
That is a very natural reaction, but Kollontai argues it's not about individual malice or duplicity. It is not about bourgeois women twirling their mustaches and planning betrayal.
Go on.
That is the trap of looking at history through the lens of individual morality. Kollontai is diagnosing a structural reality. She writes the definitive line in the text. Class instinct always shows itself to be more powerful than the noble enthusiasms of above-class politics.
Class instinct.
Yes, it fundamentally does not matter how sincere, how progressive, or how well-intentioned an individual bourgeois feminist might be. The moment the legal barrier is removed and she gains access to state power, her material reality dictates her actions. She inherently becomes a defender of her class privileges.
Let's play out the mechanics of that in a hypothetical parliament. Imagine a bourgeois feminist gets elected. She genuinely wants to help working women. But a bill comes across her desk to drastically raise factory wages, mandate an 8-hour workday, and create a heavily funded state-run childcare system.
A proletarian dream bill.
Right. But funding that bill would require imposing massive, ruinous taxes on the textile mills and factories that her own family, her husband, and her political donors own. What does she do?
Her class instinct overrides her gender solidarity. The formal goals of the two women might initially look the same. They both want to reform the civil code, for example. But the application of that reform will always serve the needs of the bourgeoisie.
She won't vote to bankrupt her own family.
Exactly. The bourgeois parliamentarian will argue that the wage hike is too radical, that it will destroy the economy, that reforms must be gradual. Kollontai notes historically that whenever class struggle truly intensifies, whenever the proletariat demands real structural economic change, the bourgeois feminists leave the battlefield in a fright.
They retreat.
They instantly retreat to the safety of comfortable bourgeois liberalism, defending the very capitalist system that oppresses the working women they claimed as sisters.
It is an irreconcilable conflict of interest. Therefore, Kollontai's ultimate, unyielding advice to working women is to absolutely reject the feminist alliance. She urges them to turn away from the mirage of a universal women's movement and stay firmly rooted within the social democracy movement.
And she roots this in a long historical tradition. She points out that since the publication of the Communist Manifesto in 1848, the social democratic movement has theoretically and practically defended the interests of women, not as a separate, isolated demographic, but as an integrated, essential part of the working class.
The socialist movement does not view women's liberation as a side quest.
No, or a special interest issue. It views it as an absolute prerequisite for the total liberation of humanity. You cannot dismantle capitalism if half the working class is subjugated in the home.
She concludes with this incredibly powerful directive. She tells the working women not to be deceived by soaring speeches about the world all women share. There is no shared world between the woman who owns the factory and the woman who bleeds in it. Working women must fiercely guard their class interests.
They can't compromise.
They must focus on building an entirely new society from the ground up, rather than begging for a slightly more comfortable seat in the old, burning building.
It is a phenomenal piece of political analysis. It forces the reader to discard sentimentality and look at the brutal, mechanical levers of power and economics.
Let's step back and look at the sheer, magnificent scale of what we've unpacked today. We started in the bitter cold of 1908 Russia, looking at a seemingly innocuous women's congress that merely forgot to put labor on the agenda. And through Kollontai's relentless analytical lens, we traced that single oversight all the way down to the bedrock of society, revealing a fundamental, unbridgeable incompatibility between classes.
She saw right through it.
She really did. She wasn't just asking for a seat at the table. She was pointing out that the table itself, the entire room, the entire building, was built on the broken backs of the working class. And to ask to sit at that table alongside the exploiters was simply asking to become a manager of your own oppression.
And this is exactly why diving into these dense historical texts matters for you, the listener, right now in the present day. When we evaluate any modern political movement, any campaign, any corporate initiative, any hashtag that claims to represent everyone in a specific demographic, whether that is based on gender or generation or any other identity.
Yeah, we see that all the time today.
Kollontai reaches out from 1908 and challenges us to look under the hood. She demands that we ask the uncomfortable material questions. Who is actually funding this movement? What are their specific material interests? And who actually benefits when the finish line is crossed?
Are the gains of this movement going to be distributed equally to the most vulnerable?
Or will the newly won power simply pool at the top, benefiting those who are already comfortable?
It's an analytical lens that completely shifts how you view the concept of progress itself. Which brings me to a final thought for you to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. If a political or social movement successfully fights for and wins equality for a historically marginalized group, but it does so by seamlessly integrating that group into an economic system that fundamentally requires an underclass to function, did that movement actually achieve equality?
That's the real question.
Or did they just diversify the management team of the burning building? Thank you, as always, for taking this deep dive with us into the complex, fiercely debated roots of the women's question. Keep questioning the source of the narratives around you. Keep looking for the hidden economic engines driving the headlines, and we will see you on the next deep dive.